Hey there and welcome. Today we are diving deep into a really fascinating topic, the creation of the modern education system in India during the British colonial era. And believe me, it's a wild story. It's full of conflicting ideas, very practical, sometimes selfish needs, and it's left a legacy that India is still grappling with right now. So let's get into it.
So let's kick things off with a pretty big question. Why on earth would a massive trading company, the East India Company, whose whole deal was profit and, running things, why would they ever get into the business of building schools? I mean, it sounds kind of weird, right? But the answer to that question, well, it tells us everything about what their real goals were for India.
All right, here's how we're going to break this down. Think of it like a five-part story. First, we'll look at the company's very first classrooms. Then we'll dive into a huge debate about language. After that, we'll see the one decision that changed everything. Then we'll check out the actual blueprint for the empire's schools, and finally, we'll tackle the really complex legacy it all left behind.
Okay, first up, the unlikely beginnings. Now, you might think this all started with some grand, noble vision for educating everyone in India. But nope, not at all. It actually began with a much more down-to-earth problem for the East India Company. How do you even begin to govern a place this huge and this complex? And if you look at the very first schools they set up, you can see exactly what I mean. These were not for the general public. You had the Calcutta Madrasa in 1771 and the Sanskrit College in 1791. Their purpose? To train Indian experts who could help British judges understand local laws. Then you had the College of Fort William in 1800, which was actually for the new British civil servants. See the pattern? It was all about making the administration run smoother. But then came a real game changer, the Charter Act of 1813. For years, Christian missionaries and Indian reformers had been pushing for this, and finally, the company was legally forced to take some responsibility for education. They had to set aside 1 lakh rupees every year for it. It might not sound like a ton of money now, but this was huge. For the very first time, education became an official government project.
So now we get to the great language debate, a real clash of visions. Because as soon as the company had this new responsibility, and the money to go with it, a massive fight broke out. Nobody could agree on how to actually spend it. It turned into this huge debate about the very soul of what education in India should be. The two big questions were, what should students be taught? And crucially, in what language?
So you basically had two big camps. On one side were the Orientalists. They believed in promoting traditional Indian learning, in languages like Sanskrit and Arabic. They thought maybe you could mix in a bit of Western science with that. But on the other side, you had the Anglicists. And they were like, no way. They argued that the only real path to progress was to teach Western knowledge, European literature and science, and to do it all in English.
And it's really important to remember, this wasn't just a debate between a bunch of British guys. A really powerful third voice joined the conversation. Influential Indian thinkers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And they argued passionately that for India to move forward, to progress, it needed to embrace modern Western education. For them, looking backward wasn't the answer.
So you've got this huge deadlock, right? Well, it was finally broken by one man. His name was Thomas Babington Macaulay. He was the head of the Education Committee. And in 1835, he laid out an argument so powerful, so decisive, that it ended the debate and basically set the direction for education in India for the next 100 years.
And in his famous Minute on Indian Education, Macaulay didn't mince words. The goal, he said, wasn't to educate everyone. No, the goal was to create a very specific type of person, a class of Indians who would be, and I'm quoting here, English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These people were meant to be the interpreters, the bridge between the British rulers and the millions of Indians they governed.
This whole strategy got a name, the downward filtration theory. And the logic behind it was, well, simple and pretty controversial. The idea was this: since funds were limited, you focus all your energy and money on educating a small elite group from the upper and middle classes. And then, in theory, all that knowledge and all those modern ideas would just kind of trickle down or filter down to everyone else. You can kind of picture it like a pyramid, right? You educate the very top layer, and you just hope that knowledge somehow makes its way down to the massive base. But in reality, it didn't really work out that way. What it often did was create a completely separate, English-speaking elite who didn't have much connection to the rest of the population. That filtration just didn't happen as planned.
All right, so Macaulay's verdict decided the what. It was going to be English-style education for the elite. Now came the how. How do you actually build this thing? The next step was all about turning this idea into a real, organized system for the whole of India.
And that master plan, the blueprint, arrived in 1854. It's known as Wood's Dispatch. And this document was so incredibly comprehensive, so influential, that people call it the Magna Carta of English education in India. I mean, this was it. This was the architectural plan for the entire system.
So what did it do? Well, it laid out the whole framework. It called for setting up universities, and boom, by 1857 you had them in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. It created a whole graded school system, from primary schools and local languages all the way up to high schools and colleges using English. And here's an interesting twist. On paper, it actually rejected that downward filtration theory and said the government was responsible for educating the masses.
But let's be real. What was the thinking behind this big plan? It really boiled down to three things: economics, administration, and politics. Economically, the hope was that Indians educated in a European style would develop European tastes and buy more British stuff. Administratively, they desperately needed a steady supply of cheap, loyal, English-speaking clerks to run the empire. And politically, the belief was it would make Indians more okay with British rule.
So, the system is built. The blueprint is in place. But what actually happened? What was the long-term impact? And this brings us to the final, and honestly the most complicated part of this whole story, the legacy.
Now, this system wasn't set in stone. Over the next 100 years or so, it was constantly being reviewed and changed. You had the Hunter Commission in 1882, which looked at primary education. Then the Indian Universities Act in 1904 to get more government control. The Sadler Commission came along in 1917 to overhaul university courses, all the way up to the Sargent Plan in 1944, which was actually aiming for universal education. So the blueprint was always being tweaked.
And here's where it gets really interesting and kind of ironic. Despite all the colonial motivations, the system had some seriously positive effects. It introduced a whole generation of Indians to Western ideas like democracy, liberty, and, get this, nationalism. It encouraged a new way of thinking, and it ended up giving Indian leaders the exact intellectual tools they needed to challenge British rule itself.
But on the flip side, the drawbacks were huge, and they've lasted a long, long time. In reality, educating the masses was pretty much ignored. The system created this massive gap between the English-speaking elite and everybody else. Traditional Indian systems of learning faded away. And super important areas like technical education and education for women, they were just chronically starved of funds.
And just to give you an idea of how much technical education was neglected, think about this. By 1857, in a country with hundreds of millions of people, there were only 3 medical colleges and just 1 engineering college. The focus was so overwhelmingly on producing clerks and administrators, not doctors, scientists, or engineers. And that right there is the central paradox of this entire story. The British built an education system designed to strengthen and serve their empire, but in the end, it was that exact system that created the leaders and spread the ideas that would bring the whole thing down.
And so that leaves us with a final question to chew on. When you look at education and society in India today, the focus on exams, the gap between English and local language schooling, how much of that is an echo of this 200-year-old blueprint? A blueprint designed for a totally different time and for a completely different purpose. It really makes you think, doesn't it? Thanks so much for joining me.